Welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. So we've changed venue again, and we're located today on the island of Delos, which is a Greek island. And the reason that I brought you here is because there are very nice 1st century, 2nd century BC houses that are left over in Delos. And you can see behind me a courtyard from one of those houses. Now, you didn't read the very first part of the Republic, where Plato explains where Socrates is going and where all of this happens in context. But it happens at the house of a fairly wealthy person in Athens. And he's throwing kind of a party. Now, Socrates didn't really mean to be there, but he ends up there, and so he's pressed in with all of these other people. And you can kind of imagine a time where people are gathering together and they're having these conversations around the common courtyard, which would be in a Greek home. And Thrasymachus is sitting across the courtyard. He's been looking at them and trying to get into this conversation, kind of trying to break into the circle of people there as Socrates goes on, because he really wants to have a shot at Socrates and the possibility of getting into an argument with Socrates. So this sets the stage for what we're going to be doing today, which is looking at a good chunk of the first chapter of the Republic, which takes on some of the central issues of the Republic, perhaps even setting the theme for the entire work. Now, this reading is centered around two questions, two basic questions that run throughout the first half and the second half consecutively. The first question is, what is justice, or what is just? The second question is, does justice make for a good, fulfilling, or happy life? Does justice make for a good, fulfilling, or happy life? So they start off, and about through the first half of the dialogue, they're working through whether what justice is and how to think about justice. Then once they've got that kind of established, once they've nailed that down, then they go on to make arguments about whether you'd want to live a just life or not. And that should bring us back around to the question of the Ring of Gyges, which we'll get to again before the end of this. What we're going to do today is to look through this reading that you have and do a fairly close reading of the different arguments that are placed forward for the different positions that are offered. And basically it works out such that Thrasymachus puts forward positions and Socrates then questions them. And we can derive a little bit about what Socrates' position is on the basis of what he's arguing against. However, we don't want to take too much from Socrates at this point. As I'll suggest in the next section, we really get a more full picture of what Plato thinks, put in Socrates' voice, right? What Plato thinks as we go on through the rest of the Republic. And we'll pick that up in the next video lecture, and we'll talk about it some more there. But here we're going to have some ground clearing, and we're going to rehearse some of the themes that are so central to the Republic. So that said, let's start looking at the first question that shows up in this dialogue. The question is, what is justice? Now, as you've read, Thrasymachus is waiting to kind of barge into this argument, and he's described almost like a ferocious animal that comes in just kind of salivating over the possibility of having an argument with Socrates. And as he goes, he's fairly insulting to Socrates as he goes about it, looking like he really wants to kind of have a fight over these things. And at points, it's not even clear that they're sure that it's an intellectual fight that he wants to have, because they talk about being almost frightened of how out of control he is. And we'll come back to that, but we want to get to a little bit of what he wants to offer or put forward in this dialogue to get things started. Now, in order to help us out with the visuals here and to get the picture of the dialogue going on, I want to introduce a couple of friends, a couple of people, a couple of faces actually. A couple of faces that I'm going to have representing Thrasymachus and Socrates. So this is the picture that I'm going to have for Thrasymachus. We don't know a lot about Thrasymachus. He was a sophist, he was a philosopher of the time, and because of this dialogue, he gets represented as being a kind of person who was concerned about arguing more than truth. But that's probably not an incredibly sympathetic picture of him. But what we have here is a picture of who we're going to represent as Thrasymachus. Now, we can compare that then to the figure that I have for Socrates. Now, if you look over and you think, well, that's not really very sympathetic either because Socrates is pretty ugly, well, that's actually how he's described by Plato. Socrates is said to be a little bit pudgy, snub-nosed, not particularly attractive, and so he gets this kind of bust that you usually see if you get a picture of Socrates. He looks kind of like this. And in part, no doubt, that's to represent the fact that what was special about Socrates wasn't his outward appearance or anything like that. It really was his mind. And so that's what Plato is most concerned about. Although, honestly, all historical stories about what Socrates looked like say he was pretty ugly. So I'm just not going to argue with it. In any case, so this is Socrates. So as we go back and forth, you'll be able to tell in part who's making the point on the basis of whose face is up there and who's doing things. So if I forget to mention who it is that's asserting some point or making some argument, you can look up there and say, hey, look, that's Socrates, or hey, look, that's Thrasymachus. Those are going to be the two people that we focus on in this dialogue, even though Glaucon and Polemarchus also have shorter speaking roles. They show up more in the end of the Republic. Okay, so let's go forward with our discussion in the midst of this party in Athens. So the first thing you need if you're going to have an argument is something to argue about. And the thing that we're going to argue about is the content of justice. So Socrates he eventually gets Thrasymachus to put forward a definition of what justice is. And inevitably, this is how Socrates goes about things. He tries to get other people to state their positions so that he can be critical of those positions. We mentioned in the last lecture that Socrates was perhaps annoying and people didn't like him a whole great deal, at least if they were kind of powerful people or people who thought a lot about themselves, because they liked to think they were right about things, and he liked to get them to say things and then kind of rip down what they said. But in any case, so Thrasymachus puts forward an account of justice when he says, justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. Now, this might seem like a kind of strange definition of justice to you, and it probably would have to the ancient Greeks. And so it's worth saying a little bit about how he supports this as a definition of justice. And in order to do that, you need a couple of supporting premises or supporting sentences in order to hold up the argument. Now, what he says is, well, wouldn't you agree that laws are just? Like, following the law in general is the just thing to do. Now, that seems plausible. So we say, okay, then following the law is something that's just to do. And he says, well, who makes the laws? Isn't it the case that the people who are in charge, the people who rule in the society, are the people who make the laws? And again, kind of intuitively open to this. And so we say, okay, maybe it's the rulers that make the laws. Well, then aren't those rulers the strongest people in society, given the nature that they are, in fact, rulers? Well, seems to be the case that, in fact, they would be amongst the strongest in the society, at least by some definition. Then Thrasymachus says, well, and don't those rulers make laws that are in their own interests? Now, this is probably the most vulnerable place in his argument, although he has another supporting premise to kind of push this claim a little bit further, which is basically this. If you find a democracy, it's ruled by the people, the demos, and they tend to make laws that protect democracy, the people. And if you find a monarchy, well, that's run by one person, the monarch. Well, doesn't the monarch usually make laws to protect the monarchy? Doesn't the monarch make laws about how you should hand down from father to son, or from mother to son, or mother to daughter, how the monarchy goes? Don't they set up these laws to protect themselves? Now, again, this premise is kind of intuitively plausible, and so we might be willing to go along with this. But at this point, he thinks he has us, because now he wants to say, justice then is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, because justice is the law is made by rulers, and rulers make laws in their own interest. This ties him to definition 2. And definition 2, I want to distinguish, because you might think that he's saying exactly the same thing when he says this in the dialogue, but really there's an important difference between his claim that justice is the interest of the stronger and what he's come out of his argument with. So now definition 2 is to say laws which are made by the rulers for their own interests are the justice which they deliver to their subjects. So justice is now the laws that the rulers make, presumably in their self-interest. So definition 1 is that justice is the self-interest of the strongest. Definition 2 is that justice is the laws which the rulers, the strongest, make in service to their own interests. Now, what's the distinction between these? Well, that's exactly what Socrates wants to pick up on in his first argument against Thrasymachus. So Socrates is going to offer several arguments against Thrasymachus's claim that justice is the interest of the stronger. I'm going to name the first argument that he puts against Thrasymachus as the argument from ignorance. Now, this is not his own ignorance. Rather, it's the ignorance of the people that Thrasymachus thinks are the strongest. Note that Thrasymachus hasn't said anything about the fact that about whether the people who are in charge are the smartest in society, whether they have the most knowledge. He has not specified anything about how intelligent they are. He simply said that they are the rulers and thus they're the strongest in society. So now Socrates can come back at Thrasymachus and say, okay, but we seem to have a problem, because if these people are not perfectly knowledgeable, sometimes it seems that when they make the law, they might think that they're making a law that's in their best interest, but they might actually not be making a law that's in their best interest, right? So, for instance, let's say that I am the ruler of our class, and I make a law that I think is in my own interest. I'm not particularly fond of fish. So I make a law that no one can now eat fish in our that's a member of our class, right? So I set forth this law. Now I think I'm doing it in my own interest because I don't like fish. But what if it's the case that fish has some nutrients in it that in fact are good for me, and I just didn't know that it had those nutrients? Well, provided that I'm not perfectly knowledgeable, I might have made a law thinking that it was in my own interest, but I might be wrong about that. So what do we do at this point? Because On the one hand, Thrasymachus has said that justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger, whatever is in my interest. But in his second definition, he said justice is whatever laws are made by the stronger that are in their interest. Now, there's a problem here, because if I make a law that I think is in my own interest, but is in fact not in my own interest, then following the law would not be the just thing to do if you're supposed to do what's truly in my interest. Now, what Socrates is pointing out here is that there's a conflict between the two definitions that Thrasymachus has offered. Now, this might seem like a kind of fancy way of playing a game of gotcha in philosophy, and there's a lot of philosophy that can end up looking like playing a game of gotcha, like I've trapped you in a corner logically, and so you're the loser of this game, almost like you're playing chess or something like that. But there's actually something more going on here. And in order to figure out exactly what that is, we need to remember back to the story of the cave. Socrates' story of the cave, and remember the marks that he thinks leaders ought to have. And the number one mark of leadership for Socrates is, of course, knowledge. Ding, ding, ding. So here, he's pressing Thrasymachus on the fact that Thrasymachus has not embraced what Socrates takes to be the definitive characteristic that you should want of a leader. Thrasymachus is focused on the strength of a leader, thinking that apparently might makes right, that the strongest person, in fact, makes the laws, and no one else should be in the place to question those laws. They just have to put up with it. But Socrates is pressing him on this, and he seems to say, look, as long as there's ignorance in the process, even the strongest can't make laws that are in their own interest. So unless you have knowledge as your requirement for leadership, any account of justice that you put forward is going to have problems, because they won't make the right laws even for their own interest, right? So there's actually more going on here than may seem in the dialogue, because at stake is a question about knowledge. Now, Thrasymachus isn't done. He wants to come back at this point and patch his argument. By Thrasymachus's patch, I don't mean like a pumpkin patch or whatever you might grow in a patch other than pumpkins. A briar patch. A briar patch would be another patch. Those would be wrong. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a patch, like a patch on a tire. He wants to patch his argument back up to see if he can survive the problem that Socrates has given him. And so he suggests, okay, so throw out all the times when the leader would in fact be wrong. Let's only assume that we're really calling them the strongest, when in fact they make right decisions. Because if they made wrong decisions, then there's a weakness in them, a kind of intellectual weakness. So sure, whatever, we'll only consider them the strongest when they do in fact make laws that are in their own interest. Now, it's not clear that he's overcome all of Socrates' objections here from the first argument, but at least this is enough to get Socrates to go on and try a different way of attacking Thrasymachus' claim that justice is what's in the interest of the stronger. So let's look at the argument from art or office. This is the second argument that Socrates offers in response to Thrasymachus. And what he's interested in here is taking another piece of Thrasymachus' argument, that which says that the ruler will make laws that are in their own interest. This presumes that the ruler is in the business of ruling for selfish or egoistic purposes. The ruler, as Thrasymachus imagines the ruler, is an egoist, a person who is selfish and who leads for selfish purposes. Now, Socrates wants to attack that part of Thrasymachus' argument now. And he says, okay, let's assume that leadership is a kind of art or office, or in this translation, it calls it possibly a type of science, right? So leadership is a particular kind of activity, an art. Well, there are multiple different arts or activities or offices that people could participate in. So, for instance, there's the role of a doctor, the art of medicine, or there's the role of the ship captain, right, who captains a ship. Well, that's obvious. He's a ship captain. So there are multiple different roles, and he says, let's assume that these different arts or offices basically work the same, at least in terms of when we're talking about their excellence, their virtue, which justice is going to be a kind of virtue, as we'll see. So when a doctor's performing properly, right, we'll assume that the doctor in many ways will reflect the kind of leader that we're looking for. Now, Socrates then goes through these roles and looks at them in particular. So the doctor, when the doctor practices the art of medicine, is the doctor serving him or herself? Right? When the doctor does medicine, is the doctor serving him or herself? He asked Thrasymachus. Now, the answer seems obvious, no. The doctor is serving the patient. The doctor works on the patient. Otherwise, you would have this absurd situation where when the surgeon goes in, he's doing surgery on himself to make himself better. So, this person doesn't seem to be acting as an egoist. As a matter of fact, if he or she did, we wouldn't even recognize that as practicing the art of medicine. So then Socrates continues on. What about the ship's captain? Is the ship's captain practicing the art of captaining for his or her own good, or for the good of the sailors that are on the ship? Now, the answer to this one might not be as clear to you, but we can think about a kind of example that might make it a little bit more clear. It said, right, who goes down last? Who goes down with the ship? Who's the last off of the ship if it's going down? Well, the captain. Now, that's not because the captain's selfish. The captain doesn't want to go down with the ship, right? But the captain is willing to do this for the ship, for the crew. So in this case, it doesn't seem that a captain in the art of captaining does it for egoistic purposes. So this seems wrong. Plato goes one more. He says, let's look at the horseman. That's not right. Let's look at the horseman, right? And here we ought to think about somebody who is perhaps owned horses, but also we ought to think about like the stable boy, the person who actually cares for the horses, right? And does this person in the art of caring for the horses, it just answered my own question. Of course, the art of this person is not to be selfish, but it is in fact to take care of the animals. So it's taking care of others, says Socrates. Now, if all of these examples are good examples of art and office, and they all suggest that the person who is the artist, the person who is doing the art, doesn't serve themselves, but in fact serves, as Socrates says, the weaker or the other, right? So the doctor works on the person who has an illness, works on the weaker person. Then this doesn't seem to go together with the picture of the ruler that Thrasymachus is giving us, because that ruler is interested in himself, egoism. Now, Thrasymachus isn't quite done here. He's got a way of coming back, although his argument at this point is already starting to fall apart, and he's already partially abandoning it, even as he makes his rebuttal against Socrates and tries to kind of make fun of Socrates as he goes. He kind of says, well, you're an idiot, Socrates, because you've missed a perfectly good example here. The example of the shepherd. So the art of shepherding, says Thrasymachus, is an art, an office, the office of the shepherd. Wouldn't you say so, Socrates? But what is it that the shepherd does? But that the shepherd fattens up the sheep for the slaughter. And this is what a ruler should be like. A ruler should be like the shepherd, that doesn't really take care of the sheep for themselves, but takes care of the sheep because they're useful to the shepherd. Because the shepherd gets something out of it. And eventually, when time is up, the ruler is free to slaughter the followers if that's what's most useful, right? So Thrasymachus says, well, we can answer this easily with the example of the art or office of the shepherd. So, how does Socrates respond to this? Well, Socrates is actually perfectly willing to take this on. He says, oh, my good friend Thrasymachus. It's not clear if Socrates is playing him. He's always really nice to Thrasymachus, but whether he's kind of making fun of him at the same time. So Thrasymachus, my good man Thrasymachus, I think you've confused the art of shepherding with the art of those who sell the sheep or those who eat the sheep. We might think that in current terms, he's confused the art of shepherding with the art of the butcher. So Socrates says, no. If you look at no, that's what I just said right there. So Socrates says, if you look at the art of the shepherd is serving the sheep. The shepherd, in fact, keeps the sheep safe. That's the shepherd's job. Now, the shepherd hands the sheep over or participates in a different practice, which is the practice of the person selling the sheep. So he shifts into a different art when he sells the sheep. And certainly this is different from the art of the butcher, who would actually cut the sheep up. Now, what's different is the activity of the butcher is not in service to the sheep. But that's not to say that the butcher is not in service to the other. The butcher serves the customers who come and get meat. So as a matter of fact, the shepherd is serving others, and the butcher is serving others. All that we need in order to sort this out is to figure out the different arts that they're involved in, or the different offices or roles that we play at different times. And once we sort them out, we'll find that all of these go along with forms of service to other people, right? Now, I do think at this point that Thrasymachus, at least whether you're convinced by the arguments, Thrasymachus thinks that he's in trouble, even if he's thought through it to that point. But Socrates is not entirely done with him here. So there's another argument that might come up at this point, which has to do with payment. Okay, but doesn't the shepherd, right, get paid in exchange for the sheep, at least when the shepherd's functioning as a salesperson, right? So could we say that the shepherd is in fact taking care of the sheep in order to make money? Now, in response to this, Socrates makes a couple of different moves. Number one is he wants to say, well, there's actually two different arts that are at question here. One is an art that has to do with economics. So the art of selling is different from the art of shepherding, right? And then he wants to say that actually the art of economics, the art that you get into in an art of selling, has more to do with payment than anything else. It's the art of paying someone for something, right? And if you're paying someone for something, you're paying for a service from them, right? So if I pay you, I only pay you if you're serving me. So here we have, says Socrates, not an argument for selfishness, the fact that people get paid for things, but another argument that all arts and practices are tied up with service to other people. If it was the case that the shepherd, say, all the shepherd did for the sheep was in fact for her or himself, then we might expect that the shepherd would do this with no pay, right? We can imagine, you think about people who are in professional sports who say they don't do it for the money, but they do it for the game, right? The game is a reward unto itself. Of course, they usually take like millions of dollars on top of that. But what Socrates wants to say is if we pay someone for doing something, that suggests that they're actually providing a service to us. And he says, so, in the case of rulers, for instance, if they collect taxes, if our tax money pays them, this is an even better argument to think that they're providing some service to others, instead of thinking that they're doing this for their own gain. Now, it's at this point that he makes another move internal to this argument, which is important to one of our themes, because it has to do with what motivates people and our relationship to material goods or property. Socrates states that there are three forms of payment that people can accept. One is money, the second is honor, the third, however, is strange. So we're familiar with accepting money for doing something. And perhaps you're familiar with doing something for honor. Here we could think of if you get compliments for having done something. Maybe you work to gain more compliments in the process. So we do things in exchange for honor. But the third thing that Socrates suggests as a possible payment is punishment for not doing the alternative. Now, this seems like a really strange form of payment. We're going to see what he's up to here in the next section, but I want to highlight something right now. Because by highlighting these three forms of payment, Socrates is actually starting out towards recognizing three different kinds of motivation that people have. And he's going to suggest that some people are motivated primarily by material goods or money. Some people are primarily motivated by honor. And then there's this third kind of person. And eventually we're going to see that they're actually motivated intrinsically. But that's not exactly how he states it here, and we're going to have to go a little bit further to figure that out. So he's worried with three different kinds of motivation, or three different kinds of people that we'll come back to in the next lecture. Okay, that said, let's look a little bit more about what he says about the good ruler here. So money and honor have no attraction for them. Good men do not wish to be openly demanding payment for governing, and so to get the name of hirelings, nor by secretly helping themselves out of the public revenues to get the names of thieves. And not being ambitious, they do not care about honor. Wherefore, necessity must be laid upon them, and they must be induced to serve from the fear of punishment. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. One is that he's recognized two vices. Now, vices are character flaws or problems of character, immoral traits that people might have. So ambitiousness is one of them, greed is another. So we don't want to be greedy or ambitious. But note that greed matches up with a desire for material goods. And ambitiousness lines up with a desire for honor. So his most excellent person won't be motivated by either greed or ambition. So they've got to be motivated by something else to come back and rule. And he says here they must be induced to serve from a fear of punishment. Now, at this point, there should be a bell going off in your head. Can you hear the bell? Ding, 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 ding. You hear the bell? So what the bell should be telling you is to remember back to the story of the cave. And the leader who once outside wants to remain in the light, but because he recognizes a duty to serve others, turns around and goes back down into the cave. The leader is not the person who wants power. The leader is not the person who wants money. At least those aren't the people you should want to have as your leaders. You should want somebody who doesn't really want to be a leader, right? And so this person has to be threatened with punishment. Now let's see a little bit more about what this punishment is, because it turns out that this punishment isn't entirely exterior. It isn't something that's done to them, but it has something to do with them themselves. This, I imagine, is the reason why the forwardness to take office, instead of waiting to be compelled, has been deemed dishonorable. So it's dishonorable to try and seek office, to go after that power. But let's talk about the worst part of the punishment. The worst part of punishment is that he who refuses to rule is liable to be ruled by one who is worse than himself. And the fear of this, I conceive, induces the good to take office. So what would be the punishment for the good person who chooses not to rule? Well, the punishment for the good person who chooses not to rule is that they allow a person who is not as good as them to step into being the ruler, right? Now note, there's no notion of humility here. Although Socrates doesn't want somebody who's after it for the power, or doesn't want somebody who's after it for the honor, this is not a person who's good is not motivated by humility. The person who's motivated by goodness knows that they are the best person to rule. They recognize that. And note what I said there. They know that they're the person who's supposed to rule. Again, we're back to knowledge being the key characteristic of the leader. They know that they're the best person to rule. And so if they don't, they know that they will be ruled over by someone who is less good. And that seems to Socrates to be a kind of punishment. And so this would motivate the good person to go and lead. As a matter of fact, this person's reward would be being the good leader instead of being ruled over by the weaker leader. Okay? So instead of being ruled over by Thrasymachus' leader, Socrates' leader, the leader who wishes to serve, will in fact go and take their place so that they're able to serve others, so that they are in the place that they ought to be in the society. It's a fascinating process of thinking, and not exactly where we would come from, especially living in a post-Christian world where humility is so important. Plato doesn't have that big of a place for humility. He really appreciates knowledge. Now, even before this, Thrasymachus' argument has been falling apart. His idea that justice is the interest of the stronger has pretty much been, in the argument, defeated at this point, or at least everybody accepts that it's been defeated. Again, you can have your arguments, and we'll see whether you think that Socrates' position is incredibly strong, in part in the forums for this class. But the people involved think that it's been fairly defeated, and Thrasymachus has actually pretty much given up on the premise that he's defining justice at all, even before we get done with Socrates' argument against him. And he shifted to something else. He shifted to the claim that injustice will make you happier, more fulfilled, lead to a better life than justice. And we can now find him saying exactly this. As a matter of fact, he takes it to the maximum. Perfect injustice is more gainful than perfect justice. perfect injustice will lead to a better life, a more gainful life than perfect justice. Again, bells. You should hear the bells going off in your head right now. And those bells should be going off because you're thinking of the question emerging from the Ring of Gyges. You remember we asked, right, what do you think actually makes you the most happy? Because we suspected that when you put on the ring and were invisible, you would actually do what you believed would make you the most happy, right? Now Thrasymachus is arguing that true knowledge would lead you to conclude that injustice is the way to go. And so if you had the ring, not only could you do injustice, but you in fact should do injustice, because this will lead to a happier life for you. Now, this is a really important question, and in some ways, the rest of the Republic will be taken up in trying to answer it. But let's take Socrates' first efforts to answer it here. So again, he's going to come back at Thrasymachus with a set of different arguments against him, because Socrates wants to argue that, in fact, justice makes one. Doing justice, and in fact, being perfectly just would make a man perfectly happy, perfectly fulfilled, right? So he starts this out with what I will call the argument from virtue or excellence. And this overlaps with the argument from art or office that we saw before. Okay, so first of all, Socrates wants to ask him, is injustice virtuous? Now, this question would sound a little bit odd in the Greek, quite odd in the Greek, as a matter of fact. So the question is kind of like, is injustice good? Which doesn't make sense, because injustice by its definition is kind of bad, right? But Thrasymachus, because he knows that the word virtuous both can mean like good and means excellent, wise, lining up with knowledge, right? He wants to claim that the truly knowledgeable person, the wise person, will in fact be unjust. He has to say in response to this, yes. Injustice is in fact virtuous, because the wise and knowledgeable person would in fact want to be unjust. Now, Socrates takes this a step further by then saying, okay, do the unjust seek to go beyond everyone else? Now, in context, this seems to raise the question, do unjust people want to have, seek to have, more power, more wealth, more goods than everyone else, right? And Socrates is in some ways going back to the question, is this really about a form of egoism that seeks self-interest in the way that your old system was, right? So will the unjust person just seek good for themselves? Will they seek the most material good? Will they seek the most honor? Will they seek the most pride? Will they seek the most power over everyone else? So will the unjust person seek to have more and be more than everyone else who's out there? Now, given his idea of injustice at this point, which he shifted from calling justice to now calling injustice, Thrasymachus again has to say yes. So now he's tied into this claim that injustice is what's wise, what's knowledgeable, what the virtuous or excellent person would do. And he's tied into the notion that the unjust person will go beyond everyone else in power, wealth, try and achieve all of these things more. So now Socrates goes back to the question of art or office. He says, let's look at the parallels then. Does the excellent artist, right, and here we're talking about people who occupy particular roles, the doctor, the musician, the sea captain, right, all of these things. Does the excellent artist go beyond all others, right? So it's not clear exactly what this would mean. I mean, we could say that perhaps the most excellent artist wants to be a better artist. So maybe the best doctor wants to be a better doctor and go beyond other doctors in that way, right? But Socrates focuses on us on a particular area. So for instance, does a doctor want to go beyond other doctors in making prescriptions? So if one doctor prescribes you one pill for your illness, should the other doctor look at that and say, oh no, I'm going to be an even more excellent doctor. I'm going to give you 2 pills for the same thing? That wouldn't actually make you a better doctor, right? I mean, like, you're a good doctor because you prescribe the appropriate thing. You're not a good doctor because you prescribe more of something. Socrates also asks about the musician, right? So imagine a musician that's tuning, well, in this case, it would be like a harp, a little lyre, or something like that, or guitar, right? So he says, would the musician be greater who goes beyond other musicians in tuning, right? So would I become a better musician if I just twist this tighter, right? If I just tune everything a little bit tighter than the other person does? Well, no, that doesn't make any sense. As a matter of fact, the person who is supposed to be tuning, they do it in relation. You tune to a proper note. You tune A to 440, right? Which is the number of, I don't know what it is. It's A440. Look it up. Anyway, you tune it to the right note. And so he says you don't get to be a better musician by outdoing somebody else in tuning, right? You tune it to the appropriate note. So does the excellent artist go beyond all others? At this point, Thrasymachus realizes he's in trouble again. He has to answer no, of course. That would be absurd for the artist to do that. Well, if the virtuous artist doesn't, why should the virtuous ruler do that? Right? If the wise artist tunes to the right amount and the wise doctor prescribes to the right amount, shouldn't the wise ruler want the appropriate amount of power? Want the appropriate amount of money? Right? Shouldn't this person want what's the right amount rather than just wanting more and more and more? Now, at stake here again, you could think that it's a small argument about particular terms, but there's something deeper at stake, which is the idea that the unjust person will be driven by a passion that has no limit. The unjust person will always want more. Now, if somebody always wants more, then at what point will they be happy with what they have? At what point will they be fulfilled? Well, Socrates seems to say this doesn't seem like a recipe for being happy. The just person is the person who wants an appropriate amount of things. And so when they have the appropriate amount, then they're happy, they're fulfilled. It's possible for them to get to this state. And Thrasymachus is, at this point, in a little bit of trouble in his argument, claiming that, in fact, the unjust person will be happier than the just person, or at least it seems that way. Now, Socrates isn't done. He wants to go ahead with another argument against Thrasymachus' claim that the unjust person will, in fact, be happier than the just person. And now he switches to another theme of his philosophy, which goes along with the exploration of virtue or excellence. Because as we're going to see in the next lecture, for Plato, put in Socrates' voice here, virtue and order are identical in many ways. To be excellent is to be properly ordered, right? So now he's going to ask about the excellence of particular groups or conglomerates and what it means to be excellent for them, where it more clearly means to be ordered. So I will call this argument the argument from order and function. Okay, so he starts out with questions about a band of robbers. Now, you could say a government or many other things, but we'll start with a band of robbers because maybe it makes his point the best. So a band of robbers, we wouldn't want to call just in general, right? I mean, they're robbers. They're going about something that is inherently unjust. They're trying to rob or steal money from somebody else. Now, this we don't have to take into account like Robin Hood or whatever else. Let's assume that people are in fact robbing people of what they have a just claim to, right? So robbers, they're unjust. But could they be perfectly unjust? Now remember that if we go back to Thrasymachus' claim, he said that the perfectly unjust person will in fact have a more fulfilling, more happy life than the perfectly just person, right? If you're completely unjust, you will in fact have a better life than the person who is completely just. Now, robbers are doing something unjust, but is it possible for them to be perfectly unjust? Is it possible for every robber to be unjust in relation to every other person, including the other robbers? Right? Now, I'm thinking here, so we can think about particular movies like Ocean's 11, where there's a group of robbers. How does the scheme work out? Note, not all the robbers do the same thing. Each one has their own part in the scheme of robbery that they have to play. And in order to play their roles, in order to be properly ordered in relation to each other, they have to have some amount of trust that they are not, in fact, going to backstab each other. As a matter of fact, inevitably, in movies about heists, this is where things break down, is that some of the robbers don't really trust each other, or somebody's actually backstabbing the others, trying to get away with something, right? But in any case, Socrates' point is this. If you ever want to have a successful band of robbers, they would at least have to have some justice internal to themselves. They would have to treat each other justly if they actually want to pull off the heist and do it successfully and come out with the thing that they're trying to rob. So as a matter of fact, says Socrates, in order to be at all successful in injustice, you have to have a little bit of justice. It doesn't follow the other way around, however. It's not that the perfectly just person, the perfectly just group of people, who are in fact properly ordered amongst themselves, have to have a little bit of injustice in relation to each other. There's no necessity there. They could in fact be perfectly just and successful. Those two things go together, says Socrates. But perfect injustice doesn't seem to go together. Now, how does this go back to the question of happiness? Well, Socrates wants to ask, okay, if this is true for a group of people, is it also true for an individual? And here we have to imagine that the individual is made up of multiple parts, which we are, right? And so all of the different parts of the self, in fact, have to function together. And he uses the example of an eye. Now, we're fairly familiar with eyes and their structure, their order. So we know that eyes have multiple different parts. They have lenses, they have rods and cones and blood vessels and other aqueous fluids and stuff. I don't know. I'm not a biologist. But in any case, you know that there are multiple parts to the eye, right? But in order to function properly, in order to be a virtuous or excellent eye, in order to be successful in your function, doesn't the eye have to be properly ordered, with all of the parts doing what they're supposed to do and not clashing with each other, right? Now, again, the answer seems to be yes. this seems to be the case, that we have to have all of the parts working, doing their own thing, contributing to the whole as they should in order to have a functioning I. Now, Socrates wants to say, well, isn't that the case in terms of the whole self? If in fact we're unjust, it seems like there will be different parts internal to us that will be fighting it out in order to figure out who's in charge, what's going on in the self, right? Now, it's not entirely clear at this point exactly what he means by that. And we're going to have to develop this again in the second lecture on the Republic, because it turns out that he has a fairly developed account of the human being and the different parts of the self. Okay, so now let's say something about what's at stake here. Because, again, there's more at play than appears to be about simply eyes working or not working or whatever happens. And here I think it'd be helpful to go back to the Ring of Gyges example. At this point, right now, being a person in public, you probably try and act good most of the time. And this, in fact, Socrates might say, puts particular limits on you. If you put on the Ring of Gyges, however, you might start to have conflicting thoughts about what you should do. Maybe your conscience would tell you not to do certain things, but another part of you would tell you it's okay. Maybe you should experiment. Maybe you should try out with this, right? Now, in the discussion of the Ring of Gyges, I suggested that students usually start with kind of small things, like playing pranks on their friends or something like that. But then as they go, they move on to thinking about bigger and perhaps more immoral things as they go. Now, in that conflict inside of yourself between your conscience and this drive that might lead you to do injustice, is it possible that that drive to injustice might be kept under control in some ways by the fact that we're public people? And what would happen if you were freed from that? What would happen if that drive towards injustice were allowed to become the most definitive part of your life? Over time, would it change who you were if you had the Ring of Gyges and started to do things that you didn't think were acceptable right now? Would it become easier and easier over time to do things that you thought were unjust? And at what point in this process would you lose track of what it was even to be a good person? Would you lose track of what it was to be human in the first place? Would you become a kind of an animal? Now, this is at the root of Socrates' argument here. Because even if you did attain something you might want to call happiness in a state of injustice, Socrates suspects that it wouldn't be human happiness. It would be something else. It would be the happiness of a beast who finds excitement in momentary emotion, momentary pleasure, but is unable to actually live a stable and fulfilling life that he thinks goes along with what it is to be just. And this is really at stake between especially perfect injustice and perfect justice, which are the terms that it's laid out in at this point in the dialogue. Now, we're going to continue on thinking about this as we get into the next section, because we're going to talk about what it would make for a just society. And we know now that that's going to be the virtuous, the excellent society. And we know that this virtue, this excellence of the society is going to have something to do with the order that the society is in, It's going to have something to do with providing service to each other. And we know something about the kind of people that are going to be leaders or rulers in this society. We know that they're people who are not going to be motivated by wealth, by honor, but somehow by the intrinsic quality of leading. Perhaps even the fact that it would be a punishment upon themselves if they didn't lead, because they know themselves to be the best of leaders. Okay, so on that note, let's go forward and let's look at the next reading from the Republic. I'll see you next time.